Hello, this is Adam Carroll with Justice for All, and this show is UN This Week. I'm speaking today with Sean Nelson of ADF International. Illegal to convert? How is the international community responding to anti-conversion laws and human rights? So, Sean Nelson serves as legal counsel for the Global Religious Freedom Global Religious Freedom with ADF International, where he advocates on behalf of Christians and other religious minorities being persecuted for their faith around the world. ADF International is a faith-based legal advocacy organization that protects fundamental freedoms and promotes the inherent dignity of all people. Working on an international level, ADF is accredited by the UN Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, the European Parliament and Commission, and the Organization of American States. The organization has participatory status with the EU's Agency for Fundamental Rights and engages regularly with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. On the local level, staff works with local partners to provide training, funding, and legal advocacy. So welcome to the show, Sean.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you so much for having me, and really appreciate it.
It's great to have you. Our organization, Justice for All, also advocates for religious minorities, but we tend to focus on Muslim minorities that are persecuted. And so, in fact, we're kind of crossing paths because we have shared interests. We see that in countries like India, that the minority communities are suffering in very similar ways. And so we've noticed that you're doing really effective advocacy in Geneva and in New York on religious freedom. And we'd like to find out a little bit more about your work. So first of all, if you could just say something about ADF.
Sure, yeah. So again, thank you for having me on and for inviting ADF International to join your show. ADF International has been around for about 10 years, and what we'd seen was just this concern that across the world there were a number of places where religious freedom seemed to be on the retreat, and so that's really one of the fundamental reasons why ADF International was formed. We have offices. We're headquartered in Vienna, offices throughout Europe. We have offices at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, as you mentioned. I'm actually in Washington, D.C., and focus on advocacy both with the U.S. and then also with persecuted religious minorities in South Asia, in East Asia, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa. We also have affiliated groups that are working over in India. There's just some fantastic partners over there, and we also have a large network of what we call allied lawyers. And so these are lawyers who are working under many times the most difficult situations of all sorts of different faith backgrounds, or even no backgrounds, who just believe in fundamental human rights. And so we work with them to make sure that victims of violence or violations of religious freedom are able to secure justice through the courts, through the legislation, things like that. And so I'm every day I'm proud and thrilled to be able to work with just such a wonderful group of other attorneys across so many different time zones. It's really encouraging to know that even though religious freedom is in a lot of places severely threatened, as you've mentioned, India is one of those places we're very, very concerned about for all religious minority groups. Both Muslims and Christians are both facing really, really serious restrictions and attacks, unfortunately. At the same time, I'm very encouraged that there are so many people who want to push this religious freedom movement globally forward and want to really help victims, and there's a lot of that going on. So that's a wonderful thing.
our NGO is called Justice for All, and though we do focus on certain groups and concerns, you can't have human rights for just some, and you can't have justice for just some, and you can't have religious freedom for just some religious groups. So it should certainly include all. And so in a place like India, maybe we should begin with India, because I see from your website that you've been very active and you have a partner organization also based there. What are your current concerns in India?
So India is a very interesting country. It's the world's largest democracy, with religious groups just spanning the gamut of every single kind, and just an immense amount of religious diversity. Groups that have been there for hundreds, thousands of years, in all sorts of different regions, from all different backgrounds, people of all different religions and races there. And so it's really a wonderfully vibrant place, and that vibrancy is something that we absolutely want to protect. Some of the things that have been very concerning in the past few years, one of these that's been very concerning is the increase in mob violence, and that's something that you're seeing, unfortunately, in many different states, all throughout India, in the north and the south. A lot of it is localized. It doesn't happen everywhere, but where it does happen, it can be really devastating to local churches, local mosques, just people trying to live out their faith without being harassed for it. We've had incidents where people have set up small churches in relatively remote areas. When all of a sudden they're having church, they're just worshiping God as they see fit, and in community with each other. And all of a sudden they will go outside, and there will be a knock at the front door of the church, and there'll be 20 people gathered there, and trying to run them out of their local church. There's also been, and I'm sure you know about this, the spate of lynching attacks. I think by the hundreds that have happened all throughout India, primarily against Muslims. And so those are things that are just it's happening really to a wide group. There are some documentations of the numbers of things that are going on, and it's just by the hundreds every year, the number of attacks, and unfortunately the number of victims, people who've been victimized, not just from there are occasional deaths, but from arrests, harassment, trying to destroy their churches, trying to close down mosques. I mentioned the lynchings, and then just the general social ostracization and marginalization of these communities that really are integral to India's history and the flourishing of the whole community. So that's something that we're really concerned about. The rationale why these are happening. Well, there's been really in the last, I'd say, 15, but especially the last 10 years, an increase in this particular kind of extremist version of a Hindu nationalist ideology that unfortunately is violent and known as Hindutva. And this is something that certainly not all Hindus share. Many reject, but there are these sort of extremists who think that India just means being Hindu, right? Who think that if you're not Hindu, then you're not really part of India. You're not authentically Indian. That your history doesn't belong here, and that in the most extreme circumstances, you don't belong here, right? That you don't belong as part of the community, and that's something that a lot of faith leaders in India are rejecting, and around the world are rejecting. But unfortunately, there's a lot of people who aren't rejecting them and who are spreading pretty nasty messages encouraging those things. So
I wondered about well, since the Prime Minister Modi came to power, the Hindutva movement, of course, has gathered a lot of power and momentum, and so it's very challenging because it's not just mob violence, but it's the speeches of elected leaders, of its policy. And so as far as conversion laws go, how would you describe those in India?
So there are, I believe it's now in about a dozen states, laws are known as anti-conversion laws. And these are laws that are designed, they actually sound, on their face like they're okay. They're designed to prevent forced conversions, right? Well, isn't that a good thing? Nobody wants a forced conversion. But if you look at the actual language and then the use in particular of these laws, the idea that they're being used because there's all these widespread forced conversions of Hindus to Islam or Hindus to Christianity, it's just not true. So these laws will prevent forced conversions or conversions in when they're procured by force, fraud, or allurement. Allurement is this very strange phrase that can mean almost anything. You could have just a potluck at your local church and invite people over, right after church. Everybody eats together. That's a very common thing. And if somebody then is interested in joining your church and interested in potentially converting, that could be seen itself as allurement in some understandings. And so that's kind of one of the legal problems in terms of just the definition of it. But I would say even the bigger problem is just the misuse of these and the ability to use that to really abuse and harass religious minorities. So people will make false claims saying your new mosque is telling people to come and come here and we'll promise you all sorts of riches. We'll promise you that you'll get into heaven, and if you don't join, well, you're going to be condemned to hell. And so these are senses of force or fraud or allurement, and then they'll grab mobs to come and kind of do that, or they will go over to local law enforcement offices, police offices, and make false claims about what's happening at these houses of worship and with these religious communities, and then they'll come around and arrest the church, lock it up. Sometimes it'll be burned if there's mob violence attending it. And what's interesting is actually that even though you have this happening in all sorts of different regions, different states, and you have this, you would think that if there really was a problem with forced conversions, that there would be a conviction at some point, right? That actually there would be a legitimate case, but there's never been a conviction under any of these laws. Instead, they're used to harass people. They arrest them, and then they might let them go, but at that point, your church has been shut down, right? The doors are locked, and so that's really what's happening.
I was wondering about if you compare the persecuted Muslim minority in India, it's a huge community. It's a minority, but there's 150 million, right? That's still a minority in India. How many people, how many Christians, more or less, are living in India? And also, are there other aspects of identity? I understand from your website that they're Christian Dalit, and maybe you could speak about what Dalit are.
Sure. So it's a smaller percentage. I think it's about 1% or just over 1% of the Indian population is Christian. So a smaller minority than the Muslim population, which is about 10% or a little bit higher than that as well. So there are a large portion of the Christians in India are Christian Dalits. So the Dalits are the lowest caste in India, at least traditionally, right? In the middle of the century, the caste system was sort of formally gotten rid of, and there were a number of laws put in place to try to help Dalits have access to different social services. But Christian Dalits are not allowed access to those services by the actual. It was an executive order, I think, presidential order at the time that prevented that. And so that's something where there is a lot of that marginalization and that lack of access to the same kinds of publicly provided goods and services that other religious groups have access to for really the poorest of the people. And because there is such a big overlap with the Christians in India and the number of and the Dalits, this is really something where there is there's a lot of tension between the religious groups at that lower end of the social hierarchy. If somebody might want to convert or go to church or something like that, and then they realize that if I do that, I'm going to lose a lot of the benefits that I have, so I shouldn't do that. Or somebody who has taken that back, may have pressure against them as well to convert back. So there's a lot of problems there. There have been some. I think there's an ongoing legal case right now at the Supreme Court about the Dalits, and every year there is a day where the Catholic Church and many of the other Christian churches mark the day that order was put forth as a time of mourning for the whole Christian community.
Well, that's distressing, but it's good to hear about the solidarity. And I was wondering if there's solidarity between the Muslim and the Christian communities in India, especially over the religious freedom concerns.
Mm-hmm. I'd say absolutely, and there's a number of different Christian organizations that actually spoke out earlier this year. If you remember, at the beginning of the COVID-19 restrictions, there were a sort of lot of news stories and kind of fake news stories and propaganda attempts to blame Muslims for gathering in mosques or large worship places and blaming them for the spread of the coronavirus and for causing COVID-19. And so that was something, I think, that where other religious groups, including a lot of Christian groups, really said, this is ridiculous. We need to put a stop to these sorts of lies and propaganda against different religious groups, just because they're a religious minority group, and because of some of the other tensions. And so that's, I think, something where increasingly it is the case where the different religious minority groups and Christians and Muslims are really standing for each other. And I think there's a sense, even from some of the from some of the political events that have happened, for example, with not including Muslims in the Citizenship Amendment bill, right? But Christians were included in that. There was this sort of attempt to kind of pit groups against each other, but I don't think that's going to be successful on a wide scale. You'll find examples here and there, but I don't think that's going to be widely successful. I think you're going to see a lot more of religious minority groups standing up for each other, because they have to, right? Absolutely, they have to.
We also work together with the Uyghur community on those concerns, and of course we're aware that the Christian community is also persecuted in China. But I wanted to move to focusing a little bit on Burma, Myanmar, because in 2015 the parliament passed the race and religion laws, which, on top of other laws restricting the rights of Rohingya Muslims, made it illegal to convert and to intermarry, put a lot of legal hurdles in the way of any kind of intermarriage or conversion. So I was wondering if you have been active responding to that. I see that in Geneva, for I think this year's meeting, well, maybe it had to do with the Universal Periodic Review process, that you all had drafted a report.
Yeah, so ADF International does have a presence at the Human Rights Committee up there in Geneva, and the Universal Periodic Review, for viewers who don't know that, is a review that happens once every 3 years for every member state of the United Nations, the Human Rights Committee, and their entire human rights systems and the events that have happened in the previous cycle are reviewed, and there are recommendations made by other states as to how that particular country can improve its record. Civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations are able to contribute reports to these reviews, and they're a really important element of the Human Rights Council's review process, because you're not going to hear the bad stuff from the states, right? They're not going to admit to what they're doing. There's independent reviewers, but it's really the civil society organizations that are often on the ground and directly in contact with the victims and with victims groups. And so on Burma, the particular anti-conversion law, one of the really terrible things about this law was that if you wanted to convert, you had to go to a local council or a local authority to basically prove that it was freely done, that there's no problems, that you're not doing it to incite other people. It just makes it completely impossible, and it puts the burden of proof on the person who is attempting to convert, who's attempting to just follow their faith and where it leads them. And the other issue with that, not just the legal ambiguity of the law, but also that the local councils that you're going to be encountering here are very often going to be hostile to the faith background or where you might be converting, the faith you might be converting to. And in Burma, it's sort of radical or radicalized form of Buddhism that it has that nationalistic element that we unfortunately also see in India, right? It's just kind of a different religion there, and you unfortunately are seeing that kind of all around the world. This increasing militancy behind kind of nationalist religious sentiment, and it's leading to exclusions of religious minorities. It's leading to threats against them. It's leading to direct violence. And in the case of Burma, just a massive refugee crisis. That it's wonderful that Bangladesh really stood up and took many of the refugees, and now you have I think 1 million in Cox's Bazar, but the circumstances that they're living in are not very good over there, and so it's really that's not a solution. That's not a long-term solution.
Right. We don't really see the political will yet, or the level of pressure robust enough, and we see China and Russia too protecting the government of Burma and its brutal military. So there's kind of been a stalemate, despite good news like the international court, process. There's definitely some momentum there, but as far as the Karen community, there are many Christians, many Baptists, and I think some of the other ethnic Kachin and others have a strong Christian presence. And just last year, I remember hearing in the news about the Burmese military bombing churches. And so, of course, there has been some kind of struggle between the, if you will, the central authority and the ethnic states, but still, there's been a willingness to target religious institutions, to close mosques. Certainly, as far as Islam goes, there's been hundreds of mosques destroyed and historical monuments, and so we say that it constitutes part of the argument that this is genocide, that there's cultural genocide as well as physical. And but moving to maybe a bit of a devil's advocate, so to speak. Since we're both faith-based organizations, we should bring the devil in for the conversation. And so when I was in Morocco years ago, and over the years, I would see missionaries coming through, very nice people, and kind of being quiet about it, right? Because it really wasn't legal. And so I could see, in a way, the both sides of well, why are they coming with, from Western countries? They have more resources. Isn't that kind of an allurement? Isn't that a kind of imperialism or neocolonialism? People can perceive it that way. And yet it is individual choice. And don't we see spiritual life and religious life in terms of the individual? So I see that, that why people are raising questions, but then instantly it becomes politicized in a way to hammer away at minority groups. So I was just wondering what you would say to that.
Absolutely, and I think the legacy of kind of colonialism and that issue is certainly one that lingers with a lot of communities. At the same time, the right to share your faith. This is not just a cultural thing. This is not about preventing people from participating in their culture. In fact, many religious traditions want to embrace their local cultures and want to kind of think about how their particular faith and what they really believe is true and what is necessary for other people to hear. Right. That's what it means to really have faith, is to be able to really want to spread that and tell other people about it. And people really do take that seriously. How can I do that while also thinking about my local culture? How can I do that without at the same time that I'm thinking how I think of this with Indian churches and how different they can look, or actually many of the churches in South and Southeast Asia, how different they look from churches that you find in Europe and churches that you find in Africa. They have their own kind of look. In Vietnam, there are these neon churches where you'll have the Virgin Mary, and there'll be a neon light around it, right? And sort of everywhere, and you have these really different and interesting local combinations. And so I would say that's really the response, that while there are those concerns and those should be talked about, we're not just talking about one kind of religious practice or another kind of thing. We're really talking about the most fundamental part of people's livelihood, their beings. And in the same way that we would want anybody here in the U.S. to be able to express their own views about what they believe, and to be able to do that free from harassment or violence, to be able to set up their own house of worship, to be able to print literature, and to share that with people freely, and without concern that they're going to be marginalized, that they're going to be excluded from governance. They're going to be their churches, their mosques, their holy sites are going to be attacked. All of those things is beyond those conversations, and to be completely fought against. Absolutely.
Yeah, all this fear of the other, it's serves certain interests, and our motto, I think, is supposed to be e pluribus unum, one out of many, which is not just about states. It's about how this country is meant to be, and which means honoring difference and embracing difference. And that's also part of the religion of Islam, but it doesn't always get promoted or talked about, but that honoring of difference. So we're going to have a quick break. This is Adam Carroll with Sean Nelson from ADF. We'll be right back.
We are Justice for All. Headquartered in the heart of downtown Chicago, Justice for All is a global humanitarian initiative dedicated to raising awareness for human rights concerns impacting vulnerable minority groups. We promote policies that protect religious freedom, address the root causes of mass displacement, and recognize the plight of refugees and forced migrants. Our diverse team of staff and volunteers, led by Imam Malik Mujahid, work tirelessly to help Justice for All achieve their goals. Past campaigns covered a wide range of humanitarian concerns. Through Bosnia Task Force, imams and leaders of Chicago's Muslim community worked to ensure Bosnia became a top national issue. This led to life-saving American policies in Bosnia. A key accomplishment was helping to get rape declared a war crime. Initiatives also included Kosovo Task Force, Central African Republic Task Force, and Flint Coalition, which brought awareness to the water crisis affecting the people of Flint, Michigan. Highlights of our work include supporting Black Lives Matter, Parliament of the World Religions, addressing climate change.
So wasteful consumption starts the ruthless production, and that's where we need all the fossil fuel in the world.
And prominent media exposure.
This is Imam Malik Mujahid, President of Justice for All.
And I'm the Director of Outreach for Justice for All.
And that's why we need to go back to what worked.
Today we're demanding an apology from the CEO of Costco.
The Chinese crackdown on Uyghurs and other Turkic people has only gotten worse.
Current programs such as Burma Task Force advocate for the rights of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, internally displaced populations, and all those denied freedom of movement and at risk of starvation. Through this, we mobilized thousands of calls to elected representatives. This paved the way for the U.S. to increase funding for Rohingya refugees from $30 million to over $600 million. 2 of our documentaries were featured on international news outlets. The Rohingya People, A Slow-Burning Genocide, on BBC World News, and Rohingya Refugees Tel Aviv Massacre was featured on CNN. We've organized rallies, UN mission visits, expanded presentations on campuses, promoted research and report writing, outreach to think tanks, media, and other influencers. Faith Coalition educates about the Rohingya genocide and crimes against humanity faced by ethnic groups in Burma. We've traveled to refugee camps, convened a meeting of Karen, Kachin, and Rohingya leaders, both to encourage cooperation and to guide them in congressional outreach. We organized Rohingya Advocacy Day. This led to over 100 participants visiting the offices of 60 U.S. senators and congressional representatives. Free Kashmir advocates for the people of Kashmir. Long-term goals include the call for self-determination, the end of the Indian military's occupation of the territory, and raising awareness of Kashmiri issues among the American people. After the August 5th reinvasion of Kashmir, we organized national protests in front of various Indian government buildings, partnered with Stand With Kashmir, and launched a petition condemning the Gates Foundation's decision to present Prime Minister Modi a humanitarian award. Save Uyghur informs Muslims and neighbors of other faiths about the ongoing cultural genocide of Uyghur Muslims and mobilizes public support. Our projects include boycotting Chinese products with our Fast from China campaign, pushing Bill S-178 in the Senate, and organizing a nationwide protest of Costco. Together, we can continue to stand up for justice. Justice for all.
Okay, we're back, and this is Adam Carroll with Justice for All. The show is UN This Week, and we're here with Sean Nelson from ADF International, speaking about religious freedom. And we've been speaking about some Asian countries, and now I wanted to see if we could move on to speak about the Muslim world, because certainly there are concerns about religious freedom in many Muslim nations. And whether that's targeting Muslim minorities themselves or non-Muslim groups. During the Ottoman Empire, there was a system, millet system, which, though imperfect, was a system to give rights and legal status to Abrahamic religions. There have been various Islamic civilizations that have treated their religious minorities relatively well for the time. I don't want to whitewash any of that, but as far as the current situation in Muslim nations, we've got Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and other countries that really put a lot of restrictions on religious freedom. And I was wondering if you could speak about that.
Sure. Yeah. The throughout much of the Middle East, you have just a really interesting history and a really vibrant history of different countries and different backgrounds. One of the unfortunate things nowadays, really the past many decades, has been this sort of restrictive hostility to both religious minorities that, as you said, are some of them are Muslim, and also religious minorities of other faiths. You bring up Pakistan, and that's one region where the recent kind of increase in violence has been very alarming, and that there has been this sort of societal approval of extreme marginalization and exclusion of different religious minority groups, in particular, I think of the Ahmadiyya, who are severely restricted and persecuted in Pakistan. But also I'm thinking of Christians. Many people know about Asia Bibi. They know about the extreme blasphemy laws that exist in Pakistan, where you have a family dispute, or somebody is not happy because you use the same well that a Muslim family used. If you're Christian, they use that same well. They don't like that, and so they bring a claim that you insulted Islam, that you committed blasphemy, and before you know it, you have that claim there in court, and you're accused of this, and you're facing the death penalty, right, for doing nothing wrong, just living your life. And in fact, even advocates of blasphemy victims, people who are just standing up for the rights of others, they get killed. It doesn't matter how big of a politician you are. You could be killed for this. It was only just recently a man who was shot and killed in a courtroom in Pakistan with one of the cases. So that I think is something that's a very worrisome situation. That's really, I think, one of the most worrisome in the Middle East. Iran would be another place where there's just an immense amount of restrictions, and it's really this particular regime that treats all faith traditions as if they are hostile to the government that really wants to clamp down and tighten restrictions on them, except for a handful of communities in urban areas that have just been there for a very long time. And so that's something that is really extreme. In other places, there has been, I think, some improvement and some openness, which has been really welcomed in various areas. So probably the biggest turnaround story is Sudan, that went from being a brutal dictatorship to now having just gotten rid of its blasphemy and apostasy laws, that opening up avenues for women there. There's a lot of recent good developments that are happening in Sudan, and I think we absolutely have to encourage that. There's the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, just signed a historic deal with Israel, recognizing Israel, and both sides kind of gave some concessions on that, and that's just been, I think, going to be a real marker of progress. I think today Saudi Arabia said they were going to allow Israeli planes to fly to the UAE in their airspace. So there are some markers of these positive things, but I think a lot of people are wondering, okay, you've built, you allowed a mass in this country the first time in centuries, or you built a large Coptic cathedral in Cairo. Great. Are you really going to follow that up though, with more substantive openness to different religious faiths that just want to live their lives just like everybody else?
I worry that religious freedom can be used as a pawn or a chess piece in a political game, though. And that certainly there are different views of the UAE and Saudi overtures to Israel, and certainly none of that has really involved the Palestinians themselves. They haven't been involved with that so-called peacemaking. So there's a lot of skepticism about the value of that. But symbolic politics has some value, and we're watching that. As far as trying to allow freedom of religion in different nations, we've talked about India and Pakistan. We've talked about a number of countries, and certainly even in the U.S., it's a contested issue. Religious freedom can mean different things to different people, and that's okay as long as the conversation doesn't become heated or violent and no one's listening to each other. But there are some cases I read on your website of a case in Italy, maybe a few years back, about fighting to have a crucifix, or was it a cross? I'm not sure. On the wall of a public
a crucifix. Yeah, it would have been Catholic.
Yeah. So on the wall of a public school, and here, because we've got this tradition of separation of church and state, which it certainly shapes the way I think, that the idea of that makes me uncomfortable. And I think, well, I want to honor people's spirituality, but how does it feel to be a Muslim student sitting in a classroom facing crucifix? What does that feel like? And so I think it's not simple managing our diversity, but when there's mistrust and polarization, as we have in our country now, and many other countries too, unfortunately, then it escalates, and unfortunately we're seeing that trend. I wanted to bring up apostasy, though, because there's a wide range of interpretations about what apostasy is. Certainly, Ayatollah Khomeini, charged Salman Rushdie with being an apostate, rather than perhaps overbearing fool or whatever. He went right for the harshest judgment, and the idea of apostasy being punishable by death is very, very, very debatable. And even as a a kind of its definition. It really is rooted in traditions in which someone left Islam in order to become an enemy of the Prophet. It's a very specific tradition, and of course it's been built on, and there are many different legal schools and legal interpretations. But as far as apostasy goes, most Muslims, I think, though we all differ, but you will often hear Muslims say that it's up to God, and it will sort out in the end, and it's not up to us to judge who's Muslim and who's not. Not everyone agrees, but nation states and Muslim nation states that will persecute or jail people for leaving the faith, and for becoming Christian. I guess that would be a big concern of your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And so apostasy laws are one of these, particularly when it's applied with such extreme penalties, I think. But just generally the idea of apostasy laws being applied with sort of civil coercive authority is something that we absolutely are concerned with and would want not to exist anywhere. We think that those would be in violation of international law and the right to freedom of religion or belief. And that's not just to protect religious minorities, but to protect people in the majority faith, right? Who may be accused of something that they have no part of, or that are they may be forced to apologize for something that they don't need to apologize for. And so that I think that's something where we strongly would say that the concept of apostasy is something that belongs really to religious traditions, and that's important. I mean, I'm Catholic, by baptism, by my confirmation. I will always be marked, as Catholic, right? In terms of Catholic sacramental theology, and so that's a really important thing for me, and one of the things that I love about Catholicism, and I'm sure many people of all sorts of different faiths have that exact same that same kind of feeling about what it means to be a member of their faith, what it means to be part of the community of God, and that's something that is not something that should be entrusted to the civil authorities to enforce, but should be something that is about being in that spiritual community, and in that context. So I think that's how I would respond to that.
Yeah, both my grandmothers were Catholic, and so you could say in some ways I come from a Catholic family, and so I'm an example of conversion or reversion, as we like to say. But still, we're all in the same boat. Really, we're called on different paths, but they run along together. And hopefully, through dialogue such as this, we can watch out for each other and try to compete in a way that's for the best, for the higher, and in not a way to be against each other. So it's competing for the good in a sense, and hopefully we will all get there, and that's what we hope, right? And I think that we have a soul, and it's struggling, and so we see the world is struggling. So hopefully we can keep going. And so I really appreciate your coming on the show. It's meaningful.
Thank you for having me. It's been absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, and whether it's Muslim or Christian or any other group that prays, that prayer is sacred. And we need to honor each other and hopefully work together. So looking forward to speaking to you again.
Great. Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you.